Okay. Good morning. My name is Reverend Julie Davis, and I am the Editorial and Program Director at Spirituality and Practice. And Spirituality and Practice, if you are just meeting us, we host all kinds of good stuff for your spiritual journey, and you can find it all at spiritualityandpractice.com. And when you go there, if you haven't already, you will see some of our new material, including a profile on my guest this morning, Shannon Kearns, who is, sort of sitting here with me in virtual space. Good morning, Father Shannon.
Good morning. I'm so excited to be hanging out with you.
It's so great to have you beaming in from Kansas, um, and really looking forward to this conversation this morning. And I want to say hi to everyone who is joining us on Facebook Live. Good morning, good afternoon, maybe even good evening, depending on where you are in the world. We are going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have a question for Shannon, you can type it in the chat and we will get to it later in the hour. We're here today to talk about Shannon's memoir, In the Margins, and in the spirit of storytelling and centering voices from the margins. Shannon, I hope it's okay if I invite you to introduce yourself to this audience in whatever way feels life-giving and right to you this morning.
Sure. Well, I'm Father Shannon T.L. Kearns. I use he, him, his pronouns. My Cliff Notes version of my story is usually that I was raised a fundamentalist evangelical in rural Pennsylvania, who then grew up to become the first openly transgender man ordained to the old Catholic priesthood. And that's usually enough to both raise a bunch of eyebrows and also spur a bunch of follow-up questions. I think the biggest thing for me is that I consider myself a sacred storyteller, and this idea of telling stories kind of weaves through everything I do. So I am a theologian and a priest, but I'm also a playwright and a screenwriter and have written a book. And so this idea of storytelling and creating space for other people to tell their stories and equipping them to tell their stories is a big part of the work that I do.
Awesome. Well, that's perfect. I came to know your work first through the Queer Theology podcast, and then through reading your memoir, and both of which I have to say have been really instrumental in my own life in helping me integrate my queer identity with my faith identity, including my identity as a pastor and a minister, a chaplain. And so I'm super grateful for all of the work that we're going to talk about today. But before we get started too deeply into the weeds of queer theology and in the margins, Shannon, I was hoping that you would share with us a spiritual practice that's particularly meaningful or helpful to you in your faith life or your spiritual life.
Yeah, I will say that the absolute most important practice for me, really throughout my entire life, has been journaling. And it really has become a spiritual practice for me, even though I'm not doing it necessarily in a like religious or churchy way, right? Like I'm not prayer journaling, I'm not journaling in my Bible, although that's fantastic. But for me, it's really this sense of spending time reflecting, and in reflection has been pivotal throughout the course of my life. And I think as someone who was raised in a pretty high control religion and religious space, journaling became the one space where I could have total honesty and not fear any reprisals. And it also became the place where I started kind of for the first time to like take back some agency in my life. And so whenever I'm working with folks, I always recommend that they start with two things: a meditation practice and a journaling practice. And that the journaling practice be really intentional, that it's not just about like, here's what I did today, although that's important, but it's also about like, here's what I'm hoping for, here's where I'm feeling stuck, here's what is or isn't working in my life. And I found that by writing about those things really honestly, it gives you sometimes a record to look back on to say, oh, things actually have been moving, right? You get a sense sometimes where you're in the thick of it and you're like, oh, nothing is changing. But when you have this journaling practice, it's like, oh no, actually things have been moving. And I can look back and I can see I was stuck about this thing, but like I'm not stuck on that thing anymore. But it also gives you a moment to say, oh, you know what? This pattern keeps coming up. Like I keep ending up in this situation. Maybe I should do something about that, or maybe I should shift or change. And that has helped me to really be more intentional about my spiritual life. And so journaling is a practice that I recommend. And if you're feeling like I don't know where to start, it's like find a great notebook and just start writing. I will often recommend for folks that haven't journaled in a while that you set a timer, because I think what sometimes happens is that you have one great session and you write for 3 hours and then you're like, oh, I'm exhausted. I can't do that every day. And so then you fall off. And so it's actually better to like set a timer for 5 minutes, write for 5 minutes, stop writing at the end of 5 minutes, and do that again tomorrow, so that you kind of build up this practice of journaling just a little bit every day and seeing what changes for you over time.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice too, because if you set the timer and you get to 5 or 10 minutes and you think, oh, shoot, I want to do more of this, then you can,
Yeah,
you can carry over that motivation to the next day and make it a more
totally, totally.
consistent practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's great to hear you talk about journaling because I think sometimes I think writers like yourself can be the worst journalers or the best journalers. And
Yeah.
so I want to ask you about um, when you're journaling, how do you get rid of that critical voice? Because obviously you're a writer who's capable of writing absolutely beautiful sentences, paragraphs, chapters, and books. But journaling is not writing a book. So
Yeah.
how do you get rid of that inner critic so that the inner spirit can come out?
Hmm. I mean, I think for me, I'm very intentional that journaling is for me. It's mine. And it's really a space for me to process. And I often think it's like a space for me to be annoying. And what I mean by that is like when I'm journaling, I can, if I'm like obsessing about something, or like something is just bugging me, like my journal is the place that I can talk about it ad nauseum for like days on end if I need to, and not have to burden anyone else with it. And so I think that space and that reframe for me has been really important. That it's like, this journal is mine. No one else is going to see this. This is not for publication. This is really just a place for me to process, and that helps me to turn off that space of, oh, I have to like look a certain way or I have to be a certain way. And I'm probably going to be someone who's going to put like a something in my will that's like, you can't publish these things until I'm many, many years dead, right? Not that anyone would want to publish my journals because they are pretty boring. But I think being really intentional about, this is not a space for sharing. This is a space for me to work out some ideas. But even that, I'm gonna definitely take that somewhere else, uh, and polish that before I share it with anyone else. And so that has really helped me to just be honest about it. And I think that like I started journaling as a really angsty teenager, and that helps too, right? That I've had this practice for a really long time. And so I've had this practice of like all of the unrequited crushes, all of the like evangelical college drama. And so it's like, oh, no one really should see any of this. And that helps me to like take away that filter.
Well, I want to remind you that this is being recorded. So you just recorded your wishes after your
Yes.
this video to make sure that that nobody publishes the angsty journals of Shannon T.L. Kearns.
Yeah, for real.
That's I used to when I was a kid and I would journal. I don't know if it's like I feel like I can blame Anne Frank for this maybe, but I was always thinking like, what if this is published? And how stupid. But yeah, getting rid of that inner critic and just kind of seeing the journal as a box that nobody else is going to open has been a way for me to see it as a spiritual practice. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think a journal for me is also a place where I can show up as not my best self, right? But it helps me, the practice of writing as not my best self helps me to then be like, oh, I don't want to show up like that with other people, right? So if I'm in a moment where I'm angsty or I'm like mad at someone or I'm just like being petty, I think part of it like it just helps me get it out of my system so that I can show up better when I'm with people. And it gives me that outlet so I can be, so I can have one space where I can be that
Yeah.
unpolished self. And I think the other thing about journaling, and this is why I always recommend folks write things down, because there is something about once it's external from you, you can look at it and see it, and then it's like, oh, ooh, I don't want that thought, or that's not actually what I'm thinking. Or like that's not true. Like I've had this thing that's been going around and around in my mind, and now that I've written it down and I'm looking back at it, oh, that is not a true thought. Now I can move on from that. So I think it is really important, whatever tools you use, whether you write in a notebook or have a thing on your phone, like that doesn't matter, but actually writing it down and getting it out of your head does really matter. And I think that's an important practice for folks.
Yeah, I love that point that writing can actually kind of objectify your
Yes.
thoughts, turn them into a thing in the world that you can hold up and look at. And
Yeah.
the other part of that is if you can hold it up and look at it, it's not you.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
you know, you are not your emotions. They don't have to take over you. You can transform them.
Yeah, and I think especially for folks that are in a process of, what we would now call deconstruction or figuring out like there's these things that keep coming up for me that I'm afraid of or that I'm anxious of or that I feel like I've been told about God, Christianity, my spiritual practice, but like it's not sitting right. That this practice of writing it down also helps you to say, oh, is that from me or is that something that I heard, right? Like, is that thing that keeps coming up that's waking me up in the middle of the night, was that my junior high youth pastor and now it's just stuck in my head, or is that something I actually believe? And it's often not until we can identify the thing that then we can also identify whose voice are we hearing that in, that allows us to then move past it.
Right, right. So it sounds like journaling is also a way to, yeah, as you said, deconstruct and come to terms
Yeah.
with your own theology and separate what you believe from the things that you've heard from such a young age that are not really serving you.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I'm curious if writing the book in the margins had uh, any qualities of a spiritual practice, because obviously, as you're describing journaling, writing, this finished work is very different from that. But I wonder what the process of going from years and years of journaling as a way to confront maybe toxic theology, toxic religion, how that led up to, or the writing of the book, and if there was anything that felt spiritually healing about that refining process of actually writing a book about it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that a lot of both memoir, but writing in general, is figuring out what to tell and what to leave out. And so that process of really kind of distilling what are the most important things, what are the moments from my life that best highlight this point that I'm trying to make in this chapter, was a really important process. I think too, the process of memoir for me is also always about, I know I'm ready to tell a story when I've been able to make some meaning from it, when it's become less about like, this is the thing that happened, and more about, this is the thing that happened, and because of that, this. And so some of the process of writing the book was about, there were stories that would come up that it's like, I think I'm still not ready to tell that one, because I don't have the meaning part yet. And I think that is an important spiritual practice too, that we don't always have to tell every story, that not every story is for everyone, that there are some stories that are just for me. I was doing an interview with Cole Arthur Riley, who does the Black Liturgies Instagram account and wrote This Here Flesh. And she was talking about how she has a post-it on her computer of stories that she doesn't tell, that those are stories that are just for her. And I was so struck by that. I think that's such an important practice and discipline, especially for those of us who do work that is so deeply personal, right? And where our stories are intertwined with whatever theological stories we're telling, that we're really careful about, these are the things that are just for me. And so some of that process of writing this book was figuring that piece out. I think the other piece that was really exciting for me, I've been deep into Bible study since I was like 4, right? This has been my whole life. And there was a moment of choosing choosing which Bible stories I was going to engage with in the book, that I thought, like, I know all of these stories. I'm excited to write about them, and also I'm not going to discover anything new. And that there were so many moments in the writing of the book where I did discover new things, and that became some of the most fun and exciting pieces. And it was a reminder to me of like, oh yeah, this text, if we keep going back to it, no matter how well we think we know it, there's always new things to discover, partly because we're learning more, but also partly because we're new. Like, there are new things in our own lives that help us to reflect on and see things in a new way. And that was just really exciting and fun for me, and something that I like want to encourage other folks who might feel like, I don't know, I know everything in the Bible, I don't need to revisit it. There's always like new nuggets, and that's really fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for holding that up. I was wondering if you would be good enough to read to us a passage from In the Margins.
Sure. So I feel like this is a little tricky, right? Because we don't have hours. And part of what is complicated about this book is that each chapter weaves together part of my story with a part of scripture, and then invites the reader to kind of engage with their own story. And the way that it's layered is it's not complex. Like, this book is an easy read, and also it doesn't always lend itself well to excerpts. And so I just want to like name that that this has been the trick of this book. And so I actually want to just read a little bit from the introduction, which is maybe not the most exciting, but I think will help to kind of anchor the space of the book in case it's not something that you have seen or read yet. So this is from the introduction. Much of the work that exists in Christian spaces about LGBTQ plus people falls into two camps. The first camp is centered around the question, can you be LGBTQ plus and Christian? These books are often written for straight and cisgender audiences and include painstaking detail about the various Bible verses cited to condemn sexual behavior and any gender identity that deviates from a straight cisgender norm. The arguments from scripture haven't substantially changed since Virginia Ramey Mollenkott and Letha Dodson Scanzoni wrote Is the Homosexual My Neighbor, originally published in 1978. The conversation about transgender issues has been slower to reach prominence, but Justin Sabiatanis' book, Transgender, Theology, Ministries, and Communities of Faith, was originally published in 2003. These two books competently and clearly make the argument that it is indeed okay to be LGBTQ plus and Christian. The second camp is academic in nature. The deep scholarly work of people like Marcella Alphas-Reed and Patrick Chang go way beyond the basics to explore a queer theology that explodes binaries and explores a more expansive view of God. This work is vital, but for those not trained in academia, it can be inaccessible at best. This book aims for a different target, combining stories from my own life with commentary on biblical texts. It's informed by my deep love of scripture and my background as a seminary-trained priest. I've written in a way accessible to folks not in academia, and starting from the point that, yes, of course, it's okay to be LGBTQ+. More than that, LGBTQ+ people, especially transgender people, have something vital to teach the church and the world if only the world would listen. My personal story is woven into an exploration of scripture. It's told from the perspective of a white transgender man who was raised in a white American evangelical church. One of the primary critiques of queer and trans theology, and really any theology written from the perspective of marginalized people, is that we are somehow making God in our own image. This critique ignores an uncomfortable fact. All theology comes from a specific context. There is no theology that is generated from a purely objective place. It's just we've been trained to see white cisgender male as the norm and categorize everything else as identity politics. This book names a specific and particular context as a place to start when doing theology. It also says there is something to be gained by reading theology from particular people, not just for people who share those particular identities, but for all people. When I was born, the doctors looked at my body and said, it's a girl, a fate that happens every day to children all over the world. When I was born, my mother had recently reconverted to the evangelical faith of her youth. This confluence of the doctor's proclamation and my mother's reconversion set me on a course that just so happened to be headed for a collision. The course set before me said I would conform to all sorts of roles in both the church and in the world. I would be gentle, humble, quiet in church, devoted, obedient, not a leader. My life was charted from the moment of that doctor's pronouncement of my gender, how I would dress, how I would behave, and how I would live my life. This is how it was done. This is how it's always been done, except I couldn't do that. I don't know what other transgender stories you might have read or heard. I don't know what transgender story you might carry in your own flesh and bone. This is my transgender story, a story that is bound together with theology and church and scripture. I cannot help but speak in scriptural metaphor because that was the language with which I was raised. When I was born, I was wrapped in pink blankets and swaddled with evangelical theology. The blankets, like the theology, would one day threaten to suffocate me. I needed to be unbound, just like Lazarus when he came out of the tomb. This is the story of my unbinding. But it's also the story of how you too can be unbound. Unbound from beliefs that have grown too tight and threaten to choke the life out of you. Unbound from outdated notions of gender and gender roles. Unbound from only reading scripture in one way through one lens. Unbound from all that no longer gives you, me, and us life.
Mm. Mm. Thank you so much. I love in that, and I think it's really representative of, how you go from, sort of a standard introduction that situates your work in the context of what's been done before. but you end up, as you always do, I find in these chapters and even at the end of the book, in such a warm and inviting place. And so for anyone out there who hasn't read the book and just heard that excerpt, it's absolutely representative, and Shannon's writing is warm and inviting, and also challenging and new and fresh. And you can see the ways in which your experience as a trans man have led to this new lens on scripture. And it's really exciting because it is your lens is not inaccessible to those who are not LGBTQ. It's in fact enlivening for anyone who wants to dig deeper into the biblical story. And one of the stories that I was so deeply moved by is a chapter later in the book on the transfiguration of Jesus, in which, if I had to paraphrase it, I would say that what you say in that chapter with sort of an ellipsis at the end is, Jesus wasn't born knowing who he was either. And that's really powerful. And I'd love for you to just speak some more on your thinking in that chapter, and just what that has meant to you as a trans man, to see Jesus as someone who also did not know who he was, or was not known as who he really was, identified it as who he really was at the moment of birth.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for saying all of that. Before I even get to that, I want to say that I think one of the biggest compliments and pieces of feedback that I've gotten from folks who have read the book is this sense that from non-trans folks who felt represented by it and saw their own stories in it, and who kind of picked it up thinking like, oh, I'm going to learn something about trans people. And at the end, we're like, I actually learned something about myself. I'm like, yes, that was what I was hoping for. So I really want to re-emphasize, like, absolutely, I hope trans folks see themselves in this book. And also, it's not just a book about or for trans folks. It's really an invitation for all people to reflect on how reading from a trans lens helps you see your own story and understand your own body and gender and experience in the church better. And so that's kind of my big hope with this book. I think what's so fascinating to me is reading scripture through a trans lens. You start to notice things you didn't notice before, and one of those was for me how much the passion narrative of Jesus in particular echoes the story of transition. And I want to be really clear here. I'm not saying that Jesus was trans. We don't know. Maybe he was. Not going there. But and nor am I saying that like trans people are somehow like divine in the way that Jesus was divine, or that transition is the same as like crucifixion and resurrection. These are not exact metaphors. And also there was something for me of like a sense of death and resurrection in my own transition process. There was a sense of this like walking toward a fate that I didn't really understand, or I wasn't sure what the outcome was going to be. And so I saw a lot of my own self when I started to read the passion narrative as like a trans narrative. And it starts in at least some of the Gospels with this story of the transfiguration, where Jesus goes up a mountain. He doesn't take all of his followers. He doesn't even take all of the disciples. He takes his 3 closest friends, and he has this experience of the transfiguration, right? Where he gets all glowy and he hears a proclamation of his belovedness. And to me, when I reread this story, it really read as a coming out moment, right? This sense of where Jesus is saying, oh, there's more to me than I've revealed to you before. And also that revelation, both for myself and for you, now is going to mean something, because now we've got to like walk off this mountain and into this new reality. And I was so struck in reading it again by Peter's response, right? Which is, let's just stay on the mountain. Let's just stay here. And Jesus really being clear with Peter of like, no, we can't stay here. We've got to go. Like now the mission is we've got to go towards Jerusalem. And I see in so much of the Jesus story, this stepping into new spaces of identity, right? It's not lost on me that Jesus doesn't start his public ministry until he's 30. If he came out of the womb knowing exactly who he was going to be and what he was meant to do, he wouldn't have needed to wait until he was 30. There was something about the discovery, the growing into a role, that I think is really important, right? And when we don't take that seriously, when we just say, well, like Jesus was this special thing, identity, who like knew from when he was born exactly what he was here to do, that he was going to die and he was going to be resurrected, I think it lets us off the hook, right? Because we can be like, well, that's not me. I didn't know who I was, so like I don't have to do any of those things. When we instead see a person who also had a really special and unique relationship with the divine, but who eases into that ministry, who in some ways is like pushed into it by the arrest and death of his cousin John the Baptist, but who at each moment kind of steps into a new role and uncovers and takes more risks, and then as the risks get bigger and bigger, knows what's coming. I think not because of some kind of supernatural knowing, but because like, oh, this is what happens to prophets who challenge the empire, and chooses to do it anyway. That then becomes a model where it's like, oof, that calls us to do the same. If we're going to follow in the way of Jesus, we also have to follow that path, and knowing what it might cost of us, and that's the actual call. It's not this call to something supernatural, although that can be part of it. It's this call to, what are we going to do in the work of justice? How are we going to be and show up as our fullest selves and answer the call of God in our lives, to work for the most marginalized? Can we do that? Are we willing to do that, even though it might cost us everything?
Woo, okay. That was a fantastic little sermon. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And
It's a hazard of the job. You can't help but get preaching on a Wednesday afternoon.
I know it well. I know it well. Well, great. So let's perfect time to switch gears a little bit, and maybe laugh. I found myself so having little chuckles of recognition as I was reading the book, because you and I are of a similar age, and we both grew up sort of in the 90s, evangelical church, late 80s and 90s. And that was a particular, sometimes weird experience. And so, I didn't have belly laughs, but I had sort of like, he's talking about Salty, and remembering, the record albums that I used to play with Salty on them. And I'm curious if you look back at your experiences in sort of fundamentalism, evangelicalism, and laugh, and what kind of laughter it is, if there's any laughter at all.
Yeah, there's a ton of laughter, right? The pop culture in particular of the 80s and 90s evangelicalism was like weird. And while it remains weird, it was like a special kind of weird in the 80s and 90s, right? There was just a different tenor, that I don't even see when I look at Christian pop culture today. And I also think about the things that we thought were like going to be really effective in winning people to Jesus, that I now look back on and I'm like, why did anyone think that was a good idea? Like the how much miming there was in 80s and 90s evangelicalism. Like I don't know why anyone thought that was going to be effective. And so I definitely look at a lot of the kind of pop culture stuff that I engaged in and laugh. And it's a really gentle laugh, right? For me, I think often that I was doing the best I could with what I had at the time and in the world in which I was. And even the moments that I look back on and elicit cringes now, or where I'm like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. I have a lot of gentleness, right? Because I was a child. I was a child and a young teenager and really indoctrinated into this space. And the best I can do now is to, move forward and try to undo any of the harm that I might have done. But I do have a lot of like affection and grace for that kid. And realizing that for me, like I got out of that world before I really had any power to create harm. I'm sure that I definitely created harm even as a young person with the folks that I was around. And also like the best you can do in those moments is apologize, make whatever kind of amends or reparations you can, and then move forward. I think it's much different for folks that stayed in it a lot longer and into adulthood who potentially did real harm to marginalized folks. I think that there's a different healing journey, right? That those folks have to go on. And so I'm able to hold my younger self with a lot of grace, and with a lot of tenderness, even as I'm like, oh, I wish I had gotten out even sooner than I did.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I want to ask, I want to switch gears a little bit again, because I was speaking with a trans colleague of mine this week, and he and his wife have been in just real distress about the ever increasing attacks on trans folks. And it's really, he shared with me that it's really affecting his mental health. He and his wife are thinking, do we need to leave the country? Do we need to move to a state that or a town that feels safer? And he really encouraged me to ask you, if you are struggling with this anxiety in this particular political moment in the United States, and where you find sources of support and hope as a trans man.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, I feel like you can't not be struggling with that kind of anxiety. It's really disheartening and scary, and the anti-trans laws are moving so rapidly, that it's almost impossible to not be impacted. I find a lot of hope uh in my trans community, right? In the ways in which we take care of one another, we look out for each other, we are engaged in mutual aid and organizing. I take hope in the folks that continually put themselves on the line in order to push back these laws. I think of Chase Strangio, who's this incredible lawyer, who's arguing against these laws in almost every state, and manages to do it with such joy, and even in the face of losses, right? And I find that to be not a naive hope or joy, but to be a well fought and hard won hope and joy. And I think that we can look to each other for support. We can also look at the incredible trans ancestors and communities that we come from, who have been fighting these fights for centuries, right? And who have always found ways to survive, often outside of political and legal systems, right? I think of the folks that have formed communal houses, the folks that have taken care of one another in the most dire of settings, the ones who have trained themselves how to figure out our own medical needs, right? That we've been part of this work for a really long time. And so knowing our history and seeking out our history and really like connecting back to those stories and those people, I think is really essential right now, because these attacks, while they are new, they are not new, right? It's a different level. We have a different level of visibility now that we haven't had before, which I think brings with it its own threats and challenges. And also, we've always existed kind of outside of the law because the law hasn't wanted to recognize us. And so looking for the models of mutual aid and community support that we've always created to take care of ourselves and one another gives me a lot of hope, and I think is a way forward for trans folks. I do want to also offer a word of exhortation to non-trans folks, right? Because I think it's really, really vital that non-trans folks start to show up in different ways. I have been struck by how many non-trans folks are quick to tell me how loved I am, how much they support me, how welcome I am in their churches, which I so appreciate. I think that's vital. But what I actually really need is for non-trans folks to be organizing their communities against these bills, to be educating their neighbors and their relatives about the importance of trans lives, to be working in their churches and denominations to pass better polity and positions. That it's not enough for you to like love on trans folks, although that is a fantastic place to start. But that we are such a small population that if we're going to turn the tide on these things, we need allies to actually be really active in their advocacy. And that's got to go so far beyond just encouraging and supporting the trans folks in your lives to actually like doing the work with non-trans folks to push back these laws. And so like we really, really need you to get active and to get involved and to do that now before it's too late.
Yeah, thank you for that word for allies. Appreciate that. I want to finishing up this question. I want to ask something just really, really practical, Shannon. So let's say you wake up on a morning and you're feeling the anxiety, you're feeling maybe a lack of hope, a lack of joy. What do you do? What does Shannon Kearns do in that moment?
Yeah, well, I go to my journal, right? That is my first practice always, is to go to that journal and to be in that space. And then I think that there are two other things that I do. I connect with other people. And that doesn't necessarily have to be trans people, but it is connecting with people that I know are supportive and that get it, and that I don't have to explain myself to. And I think that this is it's important that I name that like anxiety and depression and desperation thrive in isolation. And so you've got to figure out a way to connect with other people. And so for me, it's reaching out to a friend, and it can just be by text, right? Of like, I'm in this space, and then talking about it, and then figuring out what's one thing I can do to be active today. And by active, I don't mean like sports or activity. I'm an indoor kid, so like that is not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about like what is something that I can do that will like get me out of my head and into community. And for me, that sometimes is making art. Sometimes it's like who's someone, what's a bill that I can make a phone call about, who is someone else I can support, right? I do something that gets me out of myself. I've been being a pen pal with someone who's incarcerated for the last year, and so sometimes it's like, how can I send a note of encouragement to him today? What is something I can do that like looks out of myself and gets me connected to community, and that does something to hopefully make the world a little bit better. And I think that those things, it's both like tending to my spirit and tending to my anxiety, and then also reminding myself I'm not alone. There's work that I can do, even in a small way, even now, that helps keep me moving.
Great. Thank you for that. I think that'll be really helpful for folks. We are just about to turn to the questions in the chat. So I want to encourage everyone who's been listening on Facebook Live, who's been watching, if you have a question, go ahead and write it in the chat, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But first, Shannon, I want to ask you, you've done so much already in your life, and what is next for you in terms of like, where is the movement of your work headed?
Yeah, so I'm kind of doing three things. I'm actually doing more than that, but three big things right now. One, I'm just about to finish up my second book, which is a book about masculinity through a trans lens and what trans men might have to say about how men can inhabit a healthy masculinity. So that will be coming out in 2025. So still kind of a little ways away from that, but I'm in the final stages of finishing that manuscript. I'm writing a play for hopefully a local high school to perform, and so I'm in the editing stages of that, and that is really exciting. And then I've been working on taking this solo. I have a solo performance show called The Body's Rapture, which is a 90-minute piece of storytelling that talks about gender and religion and their intersection, and also shows a bunch of funny videos and photographs from my evangelical childhood and performing days. I've been traveling around with that to churches and colleges, and it's a way to both educate on the trans experience, but also to encourage people to get involved. And so I'm hoping to take that to a bunch more places in 2024. I'm finding it really resonates, especially in rural communities. And so that's been really exciting to go into rural spaces and to do this show, and to have conversations about how can we support trans folks in our midst. And so I'm looking forward to doing more of that.
Wonderful. Will that show include any videos of your Christian rapping career?
It sure does. It not only includes a video of me Christian rapping and a live dance break, where I recreate the dance break from the very first time that I rapped in church, and it is a sight to behold. It is not a good sight to behold, but it is a sight.
Revealing. It's a revealing.
Is it revealing? Yes. Yes.
So, thank you on behalf of all of us who have had to do Christian rap in the 90s, myself included. That will be healing.
Yeah.
It was a thing. It wasn't a good thing, as you say, but it was a thing. Okay, so let's move to the chat. We've got a few things here. Couple questions from Doug J, who first asks, says, hello to you both. Hello, Doug. Shannon, would you ever journal memories that crop up, or you just keep it current?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely do memories too. It's kind of anything that's in my brain is fair game. And I will say that I think the process of journaling through memories was really helpful also in writing the memoir, to figure out like what are the most important details, what do I remember, and then as much as possible being able to like even check that through old journals. That was helpful. But yeah, it's a combination of memories of what's happening now, of what I'm thinking about for the future. It's all of it.
Great. Thank you. Doug J is also asking, the United Church, I think he may mean the UCC. The United Church is always touted as all-inclusive. Are there other denominations also opening their doors for those often observed as religious deviants? I can answer this too, but please go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, so I have kind of two answers to this. One is that there are a bunch of denominations that are getting better. The Episcopal Church in the United States, um, the United Church of Christ. This person might also be talking about United Church in Canada, which I think is doing better on LGBTQ plus Unitarian Universalists. The Disciples of Christ in some spaces. I think the key thing though is always you've got to look at what's happening not just on the denominational level. You have to look at what's happening in individual churches, and you have to look at are those folks living out the welcome statement, right? Because there are lots of folks that have these great welcome statements but like haven't figured out how to live that out, or who like passed a statement 20 years ago but haven't kept up on doing the work of like understanding new identities. So I think it's important to like really pay attention to what is happening in an individual parish. And I will also say that often there are denominations and churches that do a great job with gay and lesbian folks but haven't figured out how to appropriately support trans and non-binary folks or bisexual folks or polyamorous folks. And so like we have to sometimes, even when a church has a welcome, we have to push for more inclusion and really hold churches to that standard. I think it's both a like yes, and there's still a lot more work to be done.
Absolutely. And that parallels my own experience. I'm ordained in the Disciples of Christ. So thank you for naming them, and naming them in, I think, the most accurate way. In some spaces, the Disciples of Christ in the United States is an open and affirming, there are open and affirming congregations. And you're absolutely right. You want to look local. You want to look at the actual parish, the actual church. Because open and affirming means different things to different churches, even though it's supposed to mean sort of one thing across the board. There are, because I'm in this work right now, I just started a spiritual community that is open and affirming with another queer woman. I am noticing that there are more and more churches that may not necessarily be associated with denominations, but are really trying to rethink church and are being started at their foundations with queer theology, liberation theology, and anti-racism in mind. And so I would just add, it's so important to look at the leadership of the church as well that you're looking into.
Yeah, and I also just want to say, if for LGBTQ plus folks who are maybe looking for a church, if the church website doesn't have anything about inclusion on it, that's a red flag. And if you email a pastor and ask a direct question about LGBTQ plus folks, and their answer is anything other than clear, don't go to that church because they are not affirming. If they invite you for coffee, run. Like, it's just, if they cannot give you a yes, we fully affirm LGBTQ plus people, we will marry you, you can serve in ministry, you can serve at all levels of ministry, then they should be able to answer that question clearly. And there are so many churches that are like, well, and they'll like hem and haw. And if you get into that space, like, you don't even have to go visit. Just know that you can check them off of your list.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people have seen this Jesus, He's Just Like Us campaign.
Oh, yeah.
That does not include Jesus, He's Just Like You if you're queer. It called those folks, and they were good enough to do some research for me on open and affirming churches, but that is not their mission.
No. Mm-mm.
And yeah, if it doesn't say it on the website, I think you can move on. There are sites, Doug. I think one is like Clear Church or Clarity Church
Church
or
Clarity.
Church Clarity, thank you. That supposedly do some vetting for you. And also I think gaychurch.com does the same.
Gaychurch.org. And what I love about gaychurch.org is that churches have to opt in to be on that. They have to ask to be on that site. So at least if you find a church on that site, they've at least done the step of asking to be added, which is like a good sign.
Great, thank you. Okay, Lou D says, come to Chicago. So there you have, there's your invitation to Chicago.
Excellent.
And Keziah G asks, what are you reading, watching, or listening to that makes you feel hopeful or connected in this moment?
I am obsessed with the TV show Somebody Somewhere, which is an HBO show. It's set in Kansas, which is where I live now. But it's just the most delightful show that really like deals with queerness and religion and family and chosen family in such a beautiful way. It's also really, really funny. There's 2 seasons. They've been renewed for a 3rd season. So recommending that show to everyone. Really, really love that one. What am I reading? This is always the question someone asks, and I forget everything I'm reading. I'm reading The Creative Habit by Rick Rubin, which is just an interesting, really interesting book about creativity. And what I'm loving about it is the way that he talks about creativity is so spiritual, right? It's so much this connection of like, there is a creative habit that we do, and also that creative habit connects us to the divine, the universe, things that are bigger than ourselves. And I think that both and it has been really important, both in my creative life, but also in my spiritual life, right? We have these practices that we do that in many ways are habits, but that connect us to community and to things that are bigger than ourselves. And what am I listening to? I listen to, while I write, I can't listen to things with words that are in English. So I've been listening to a lot of like music in other languages, like folk music and pop music. And that's been really fun.
What other languages are you listening to?
I think I've got a bunch of Finnish and Norwegian. Those are the folks that are doing some really interesting like pop or like folk orchestral music that's beautiful to listen to, and since I can't understand it, it doesn't distract me.
Yeah, what's your favorite music or band to experience live?
The Chicks are some of the most talented performers that I've ever witnessed live. And then I also had the opportunity to see Bruce Springsteen for the first time live this year. That man, it is in his 70s. He did a 3-hour concert with no breaks. It was unreal. Like, I can't stand up for 3 hours without needing a break. The fact that he did that, I'm like, I hope that I make it that long. It was incredible. It was a really, really, and so many of the people that he's touring with are people from his original band that he's been touring with for 40 years. And there's something about that long time creative tissue and connection that I think is really, really powerful. Like, this is a man who has a creative practice that has sustained for a really long time, and that's really inspiring and beautiful to see.
I love it. The founder of spirituality and the founders of spirituality and practice are gigantic Springsteen fans. So maybe we will bring this to a close on that note. But I also, just as kind of a PSA, Shannon, can you just, for everyone who's watching and may not know, will you just outline all of the resources now that queer theology offers online, because y'all are doing some really like interactive stuff in addition to the weekly podcast.
Yeah, so queertheology.com has been around for 10 years now, really helping and supporting folks with the integration between religious and spiritual practice and sexuality and gender identity. And we also have a bunch of resources for straight cisgender supporters as well. So we have an online community called Sanctuary Collective, which is folks from all over the world who are basically just in community and hanging out together, supporting one another. We do quarterly worship services inside of that community, some other kinds of meetings and support. That's been really, really fantastic. And we're actually, this is kind of a little bit of a spoiler alert. We're transitioning to a new platform with a thing called Spiritual Study Hall, which is going to be a storehouse of all of our online resources, from articles to workshops to longer courses. We've got courses on how to read the Bible, on trans theology, on Christianity and polyamory, on how to be an active advocate, on all sorts of things. So that's all going to be housed in one place. Really, really excited about that. And then we do, like you said, a weekly podcast. We've been doing that for over 500 episodes now, which I just can't even believe. It's been, I think, about 10 years that we've been doing the podcast, 9 years. So yeah, all sorts of resources. And if there's something that you can't find that you're looking for, just let us know.
Great. You have any final words?
Just, I would love to be connected to folks. Reach out to us. We're at queertheology.com or Queer Theology or Q Theology on all of the social media. And then I'm at shannontlkearns.com and at shannontlkearns on all of the socials. I do TikTok badly, but I do the rest of them better. As an elder millennial, Gen Xer, depending on where you fall. TikTok is bridge too far, but I'm trying.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time today. I
my
really,
pleasure.
really appreciate it. And I want to, as my final word, mention that sort of in connection with the Living Spiritual Teachers profile on Shannon Kearns, you can also find reviews of the Queer Theology podcast and of his book. And we're really excited at Spirituality and Practice to announce that we are starting our own queer sort of discussion affinity group called Queer Space. And if you go to the website, you can check that out and sign up. And the first thing that we are going to do together as a group is read Shannon's book. And it's not really a book group necessarily, but it's a space where if you are queer and religious and looking for some friendship, some companionship, some support, a place, a safe place to read some stuff from your journal or to use it as a journaling and support space. We hope that you will do that. This is a brand new thing that we're doing, and it'll be facilitated by myself. So please go to our website at spiritualityandpractice.com if that sounds like something that you need in your life. So again, thank you so much, Shannon, for being with us. Please read the book, go to queertheology.com, go to spiritualityandpractice.com, and get the help and companionship and inspiration that you need. Thank you all.